Little girl played in Cornfield and vanished. 10 years later, Mum entered pig barn and found. Imagine this, a bright sunny afternoon in the heart of Nebraska, where endless rows of corn stretch as far as the eye can see. A little girl with fiery red hair and an infectious laugh plays near the edge of a cornfield, her tiny cowboy boots leaving faint imprints in the soft dirt. She's only 2 years old, full of curiosity and wonder. Her mother, busy tending to chores just a stone's throw away, glances over every few minutes to check on her. But then, in what feels like the blink of an eye, she's gone, vanished without a trace. For 10 long years, her family searched, grieved and prayed for answers that never came. But one day, something changed. One small clue, a pink Hello Kitty headband, found buried in the dirt inside a pig barn, set off a chain of events no one could have predicted. This is the story of Maggie Landry, a woman whose life was shattered when her daughter Fiona disappeared from their family farm. It's also a story about hope, resilience, and the lengths a parent will go to find their child. Maggie and her husband Hank spent a decade haunted by questions they couldn't answer. Where had Fiona gone? Was she still alive? And if so, why hadn't anyone been able to find her? Every corner of their property, and even neighboring farms, had been scoured by investigators after Fiona vanished, yet nothing turned up. The case went cold, but Maggie's determination never wavered. She carried the guilt of leaving Fiona, unattended that day, like a weight around her neck, vowing silently that she would never stop looking for her baby girl. Fast forward 10 years, and life on the Landry farm has become a quiet routine of work and grief. Maggie, now 50, spends her days tending to crops and animals, while wrestling with memories she wishes she could forget. One afternoon, she makes a delivery of hay bales to a neighbor's farm, the Becker farm. This isn't just any neighbor. Clay Becker, the man who runs it, has had a bitter feud with the Landrys for decades. Their families clashed over land disputes, arguments at town meetings, and icy stares exchanged at the county fair. Despite their animosity, business between them continued, because farming communities rely on each other to survive. As Maggie unloads the hay, she notices something unusual. A young pig darts past her, escaping its pen. Without thinking twice, she gives chase, eventually catching the animal and returning it to the barn. But as she steps inside the dimly lit structure, her attention is drawn to something lying half buried in the dirt. A small pink object catches the light. When she picks it up, her breath catches in her throat. It's a Hello Kitty headband, the kind a little girl might wear. The discovery sends Maggie spiraling back in time. She remembers Fiona's obsession with headbands, how she used to insist on wearing them everywhere, even to bed. Could this really be connected to her missing daughter? Or is it some cruel twist of fate? Maggie tries to push the thought aside, but something doesn't sit right. She confronts Clay about the headband later, casually mentioning whether he has a child, a girl. But his reaction shocks her. His face turns pale, then red with anger, and he practically orders her off his property. Something about his behavior gnaws at Maggie. Why would a simple question provoke such hostility? Back home, Maggie struggles to shake the feeling that she's stumbled onto something important. That night, as she sits alone in her truck, parked along a deserted country road, a realization hits her like a thunderclap. What if Fiona didn't just wander off into the cornfields all those years ago? What if someone took her? And what if that person is Clay Becker? The idea seems impossible, almost too monstrous to consider, but the pieces start falling into place. The headband, Clay's strange reaction, the fact that Fiona disappeared close to the Becker property. Maggie knows she can't ignore this gut feeling, no matter how crazy it sounds. She calls Hank, her voice trembling as she begs him to meet her immediately. Together, they decide to investigate further, knowing the risks involved, but unwilling to let another day pass without trying to uncover the truth. As Maggie and Vic tiptoe through the shadows of the Becker farm under the cover of darkness, their hearts pound with fear and anticipation. They've come here, hoping to find evidence that might finally bring closure to the nightmare they've lived for a decade. But what they discover inside the barn leaves them frozen in shock. In a corner of a pig enclosure, chained to a pole and covered in filth, is a small figure, a girl with unmistakable red hair. Maggie whispers her name, Fiona, but the child doesn't respond. Instead, she looks up with wide, fearful eyes, clearly terrified. The sight breaks Maggie's heart, but there's no time to process it. She calls 911, her voice shaking as she explains what she's found. Within minutes, police sirens pierce the night air, and officers swarm the scene. Clay Becker flees into the darkness, but it's too late for him to escape justice. But here's the thing. Finding Fiona doesn't mean the story ends happily ever after. Far from it. The trauma of being held captive for 10 years has left deep scars, both visible and invisible. When Maggie and Hank are finally allowed to see her at the hospital, they're faced with a heartbreaking reality. Fiona doesn't recognize them. She barely remembers anything from her early childhood, let alone the parents who loved her more than anything. And when she asks, "What did I do wrong?" blaming herself for the horrors she endured, it's clear that healing won't be easy. As the authorities piece together Clay's confession and prepare to bring him to trial, Maggie and Hank must focus on rebuilding their shattered families. But how do you reconnect with a child who's forgotten you exist? How do you help her heal from wounds so deep they may never fully fade? That's where we leave things for now. The Landrys have found Fiona against all odds, but the journey ahead is fraught with challenges. Will they be able to rebuild the bond they once shared? Can Fiona overcome the trauma of her captivity and learn to trust again? And most importantly, will justice truly be served for the unimaginable crime committed against her? Stay tuned for the next part of this incredible story, where we dive deeper into Fiona's recovery, Clay's motives, and the resilience of a family determined to rise above tragedy. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss a single update. Until next time, thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the hardest battles lead to the greatest victories. Maggie and Hank's world had been turned upside down the moment Fiona disappeared. They weren't just farmers, they were parents who lived for their little girl. Before that fateful day, life on the Landry farm was simple but full of joy. Maggie would sing old country songs while working in the kitchen, and Fiona would toddle after her, giggling as she tried to mimic the words. Hank spent his days fixing fences or tending to the livestock, always making time to lift Fiona onto his shoulders so she could see over the tall cornfields. Those memories now felt like fragments of a dream, beautiful yet unreachable. The police had searched tirelessly at first, combing through fields, interviewing neighbors, and even bringing in search dogs. But as weeks turned into months, then years, hope began to fade. People whispered behind closed doors about how accidents happen, especially with young children living near open land. Some suggested Fiona might have wandered too far and fallen victim to nature, or worse, someone else. But no one ever spoke aloud what Maggie feared most, that Fiona was still out there, alive but unable to come home. The feud with Clay Becker wasn't some trivial squabble over property lines. It ran deeper than that. It started years before Fiona was born. when Hank's father sold a small parcel of land to Clay's family under unclear terms. Decades later, disagreements arose over water rights and access roads, sparking arguments that spilled into town meetings and legal battles. Clay, a bitter man with a short temper, resented the Landrys for reasons that seemed petty to outsiders. He'd once accused Hank of sabotaging his tractor, though there was no evidence to support it. Over time, the animosity grew, culminating in icy stares at church picnics and heated exchanges at the feed store. Maggie had always urged Hank to let it go, to focus on their own lives, instead of engaging in pointless fights. But now, standing in Clay's pig barn, with Fiona's headband clutched in her hand, Maggie couldn't help but wonder if this feud had cost them far more than pride or money. As authorities descended on the Becker farm, Clay's confession confirmed everyone's worst fears. He admitted to kidnapping Fiona during one of his late-night drives around the area, driven by a twisted desire for revenge against the Landrys. At first, he claimed he only meant to scare them, to teach them a lesson, but things spiraled out of control. When Fiona cried for her parents, Clay panicked, locking her away in the barn where no one would hear her screams. Over time, guilt and paranoia consumed him, leading him to treat Fiona not as a human being, but as an object to be hidden. His actions painted a chilling picture of how hatred and bitterness can warp a person's soul, turning them into something unrecognizable. Yet despite the clarity of his confession, questions lingered. How could someone commit such a monstrous act and live with themselves for 10 years? And why hadn't anyone noticed Fiona's absence sooner? For Fiona, those 10 years were a blur of fear, confusion, and isolation. She remembered flashes of sunlight filtering through cracks in the barn walls, the smell of hay mixed with mud, and the sound of pigs grunting nearby. Sometimes Clay brought her food, a stale sandwich or a cup of water, but he rarely spoke to her. Other times, she heard voices outside, muffled and distant, and screamed until her throat hurt, praying someone would hear her. But no one ever came. As she grew older, Fiona stopped hoping for rescue. Instead, she retreated into herself, creating imaginary worlds where she was safe and loved. By the time Maggie found her, Fiona had become a shadow of the vibrant child she once was. Her red hair was matted, her clothes torn and filthy, and her eyes hollow with despair. Seeing her like that broke Maggie's heart all over again, but it also fueled her determination to give Fiona the life she deserved. Back at the hospital, doctors worked tirelessly to assess Fiona's physical and mental condition. Malnutrition, dehydration, and exposure to unsanitary conditions had taken a toll on her body. But the emotional scars ran even deeper. Social workers assigned to her case warned Maggie and Hank that rebuilding trust wouldn't happen overnight. Fiona flinched at sudden movements, refused to make eye contact, and often curled into a ball whenever anyone approached her bed. Still, there were moments of connection, small victories that gave Maggie and Hank hope. One evening, as Maggie sat beside Fiona's bed, reading a storybook aloud, Fiona reached out hesitantly and touched Maggie's hand. It was a fleeting gesture, barely noticeable, but it meant everything to Maggie. "We'll get through this, together," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I promise." Meanwhile, tension simmered in the community as news of Fiona's rescue spread. Neighbors who had long dismissed the Landrys' pleas for help now felt a mix of shame and outrage. How could something so horrific happen right under their noses? Others directed their anger toward Clay, calling for justice to be swift and severe. Rumors swirled about his trial date, potential sentencing, and whether he'd show any remorse. for what he'd done. For Maggie and Hank, the public attention was overwhelming. Reporters camped outside their farmhouse, begging for interviews and snapshots of Fiona. Supporters left flowers and cards at their gate, while critics questioned why they hadn't been more vigilant in protecting their daughter. Through it all, Maggie remained focused on Fiona's recovery, shielding her from the chaos outside, but the pressure mounted, threatening to crack the fragile foundation of their newfound hope. Just as Fiona began showing signs of progress, a new complication arose. During a therapy session, she revealed fragments of memories that didn't align with Clay's confession. She spoke of another voice, a woman's voice, that sometimes visited her in the barn. Maggie froze, her mind racing. Could there be someone else involved? Someone helping Clay keep Fiona hidden all these years? The thought sent chills down her spine. If true, it meant the danger wasn't over. Determined to uncover the truth, Maggie pressed detectives for answers, urging them to dig deeper into Clay's past and connections. As the investigation expanded, secrets long buried in the quiet corners of their rural town began to surface, implicating others in ways no one could have imagined. With each new revelation, the stakes grew higher. Maggie and Hank found themselves caught between fighting for Fiona's future and confronting the dark truths of their community's past. Every step forward felt like 2 steps back. As Fiona struggled to adapt to her new reality, she recoiled at the sight of strangers, panicked when asked to leave the safety of her room, and clung desperately to Maggie whenever she sensed danger. Yet amidst the turmoil, tiny sparks of resilience began to shine through. Fiona smiled for the first time in years when Hank brought her a stuffed animal, a gift from a neighbor, and laughed softly when Maggie taught her how to braid her newly washed hair. These moments reminded Maggie why they couldn't give up, no matter how hard. The road ahead seemed. As the trial loomed closer, the tension reached a breaking point. Clay's lawyer argued insanity, claiming his client had acted out of delusion rather than malice. Prosecutors countered with damning evidence, including Fiona's testimony and forensic reports linking Clay to the crime scene. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation, reporters scribbling notes furiously as witnesses recounted harrowing details. Maggie and Hank sat side by side, holding hands tightly, bracing themselves for whatever verdict awaited. Outside, protesters held signs, demanding justice for Fiona, their chants echoing through the streets. Everyone wanted closure, but for Maggie, closure meant more than putting Clay behind bars. It meant giving Fiona a chance to heal, to rediscover who she was before the darkness swallowed her whole. And then came the twist none of them saw coming. On the eve of the final hearing, a mysterious letter arrived at the Landry farmhouse. Addressed to Maggie, it contained cryptic phrases about unfinished business and others watching. Attached was a photograph of Fiona playing in the Cornfield, the last day anyone had seen her before she vanished. The photo wasn't recent. It was old, yellowed with age, and clearly taken years ago. But what chilled Maggie to the bone was the figure standing in the background, partially obscured by stalks of corn. Someone had been watching Fiona that day, someone who knew exactly what happened to her, and may still pose a threat. As Maggie stared at the image, her heart pounding, she realized the nightmare was far from over. Who sent the letter? And what did they want? Stay tuned for the next chapter of this gripping story, where we unravel the mystery behind the letter, confront the lingering shadows of the past, and fight to protect Fiona from forces that refuse to let her go. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss a single update. Until next time, thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the hardest battles are fought in the quietest places. As the days turned into weeks, Fiona began to adjust to her new surroundings at the temporary social house. Maggie and Hank spent every possible moment with her, slowly piecing together fragments of their daughter's memories. It wasn't easy. Fiona still flinched at sudden movements and struggled to trust people, but there were small victories that kept them hopeful. One evening, as Maggie brushed Fiona's hair, she noticed her daughter smiling faintly in the mirror. "You used to love when I did this," Maggie said softly. Fiona didn't respond right away, but after a pause, she whispered, "It feels nice." That tiny acknowledgement felt like a breakthrough, a sign that their bond was beginning to heal. Meanwhile, Clay's trial dominated local headlines. His confession painted a chilling picture of how bitterness and revenge could twist a person beyond recognition. The courtroom was packed each day, with neighbors who had once dismissed the Landrys' pleas for help, now watching in stunned silence as the full extent of Clay's crimes unfolded. Prosecutors presented evidence gathered from the barn, including chains, locks, and personal items belonging to Fiona. Medical reports detailed the long-term effects of her captivity, leaving no doubt about the severity of his actions. When it came time for sentencing, the judge spared no words in condemning Clay's depravity. "What you did is an affront to humanity," he declared. "You will spend the rest of your life behind bars, where you can never harm another soul." For Maggie and Hank, hearing those words brought a measure of closure they hadn't dared to hope for. But the letter that arrived at the Landry farmhouse, weeks later, threatened to unravel everything. Maggie stared at the photograph enclosed with the cryptic note, her hands trembling. The image showed Fiona playing near the cornfield on the day she disappeared, but someone else was there, partially hidden among the stalks. Who had been watching her? And why send the photo now, years after the fact? Maggie called Hank into the kitchen, holding up the letter. "This changes everything," she said, her voice shaking. They immediately contacted the authorities, who launched a new investigation. Detectives combed through old case files, re-interviewed witnesses, and analyzed the photograph for clues. As they dug deeper, suspicions arose about someone else being involved. Someone close to Clay, who may have helped him keep Fiona hidden all those years. The revelation sent shockwaves through the community. Neighbors who thought they knew everyone began questioning their own assumptions. Tensions ran high as rumors spread about a potential accomplice. Maggie and Hank tried to shield Fiona from the chaos, focusing instead on helping her regain her footing. But even Fiona couldn't escape the unease entirely. One night, during a therapy session, she hesitantly mentioned seeing a woman sometimes in the barn, a figure she described as kind but sad. Her words sent chills down Maggie's spine. Could this mysterious woman be connected to the letter? Was she trying to protect Fiona or manipulate her further? The mystery deepened when investigators discovered traces of DNA on the back of the photograph that didn't match Clay or anyone in the Becker family. Forensic experts worked tirelessly to identify the source, eventually linking it to a woman named Ruth Harper, a distant relative of Clay's, who had moved away years ago. When detectives tracked her down, Ruth broke down under questioning. She admitted to knowing about Fiona's captivity, but claimed she had tried to intervene, sneaking food and water to the girl whenever she could. "I wanted to tell someone," Ruth sobbed. "But Clay, he threatened me. He said if I spoke up, he'd hurt her worse." While her confession shed light on Fiona's survival, it also raised troubling questions about Ruth's role. Had she truly been powerless, or had fear stopped her from doing more? In the end, justice found its way to both Clay and Ruth. Clay received a life sentence without parole, while Ruth faced charges for aiding and abetting his crimes. Though some argued Ruth deserved leniency for attempting to help Fiona, others believed her failure to act sooner made her complicit. For Maggie and Hank, the legal proceedings offered little comfort compared to the progress they were making with Fiona. Slowly but surely, she began to open up, sharing bits and pieces of her life in the barn. Some memories were painful, others oddly tender, like recalling how the pigs would nuzzle her hand, or how Ruth would sing lullabies to calm her fears. These stories helped Maggie and Hank understand the resilience their daughter had shown, despite unimaginable circumstances. Months passed, and Fiona finally agreed to move back home with Maggie and Hank. It wasn't an easy transition. She still had nightmares and moments of panic. But surrounded by love and patience, she started to reclaim pieces of herself. Maggie planted a small garden just for Fiona, encouraging her to nurture something beautiful. Hank taught her how to ride horses, again, reminding her of the joy she used to find in simple pleasures. Together, they celebrated milestones big and small. Her first laugh in years, her first step into the cornfield without fear, and eventually, her decision to attend school part-time. Each triumph reinforced their belief that healing was possible, even after such profound trauma. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Maggie and Hank stood side by side on the porch, watching Fiona play with their new dog, a German Shepherd puppy, meant to honor the memory of the one she barely remembered. "She's going to be okay," Hank said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Maggie nodded, tears streaming down her face. "We all are," she replied. The road ahead would still have challenges, but they faced them together, as a family reunited against all odds. For the Landrys, the nightmare of losing Fiona became a story not just of survival, but of redemption. Their journey reminded everyone who followed it that even in the darkest times, hope can shine through. Love, patience, and unwavering determination saw them through the unimaginable. And though Fiona's scars would always remain, so too would the strength she gained from overcoming them. As the stars lit up the Nebraska sky, Maggie whispered a silent prayer of gratitude. For answers found, for justice served, and for a future filled with possibilities.